So we've just seen the basis of Ezra's trust in God. His hand is good, for good, and his hand is victorious, it delivers his people. But now we're going to see how that operates in the lives of believers, the nature of trust. And we've seen how Ezra has this strong trust in the hand of God. And we're going to understand how that looks in the lives of believers under the heading ordinary and extraordinary trust. Those terms are not perfect, but they're the best I could come up with to describe this thing that we see here in Ezra chapter 8. So what do I mean? What is ordinary trust? Ordinary trust is trusting God and yet taking your own actions. It means applying wisdom, taking practical steps. Where do I get that from? Let's see in verses 15 through to 20, as we've already seen, Ezra gathers his team together, the community that he's leading back home. He gathers them together on the outskirts of Persian headquarters. And we've already seen it's a much smaller number than the first group, about 60 or so years, maybe even 80 years earlier, under the leadership of Zerubbabel. But here we have Ezra going through the congregation, doing a head count, seeing who's who, what do we have? And he realizes and he writes, "I found there none of the sons of Levi." No Levites. And as we've been thinking already, the Levites were a key part of the team. They provided an important role in the practical aspects of worship of the people of Israel. More particularly, they were needed in this circumstance to carry the sacred cargo back to Jerusalem. We saw last week that the Persian king handed many precious artifacts and articles to Ezra to be used in the worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel, back in Jerusalem at the temple. Not to mention much gold and silver for the process of worship. And according to the law of Moses, and don't forget Ezra was an expert, he was a scholar in the law of Moses, this stuff should be carried by Levites. They are the chosen tribe to aid and support the worship of Israel. This stuff, this gold and silver and merchandise, was to be used for God. So Ezra said, look, we've got to do this right. We've got to have some Levites. Now, it doesn't tell us why there were no Levites in that group. It's kind of encouraging to me, actually, as someone who's planted a church. You can cast a vision, you can pray, you can see God's hand at work, but for some reason or other, not everybody that you would love to have on your team will come with you. And that's okay. But perhaps in the situation here with these Levites, perhaps they were comfortable where they are in Babylon. Okay, it's not ideal. This is not our homeland, but you know, we're doing okay here. The journey itself had much risk attached to it. There was much uncertainty about what lay ahead, and that did not fill them with excitement, rather with fear. Maybe they thought it was too much of a sacrifice to uproot themselves and their families and go and take a flyer, take a risk. We don't know exactly why the Levites weren't there. But what did Ezra do in applying this sort of ordinary trust, if you like? Well, it says in verse 16, he selected 9 leading men from among his own little community, as they were, and 2 men of insight, 2 men of wisdom. So leading men and men of wisdom. And they sent them to this chap called Iddo, who was back in Babylon. And the idea with this little team, this detachment, was to be sent to Iddo, who was most likely a leading Levite among the exiles, and to try and persuade this man of influence to send Levites, to advocate that Levites should go back to the homeland with Ezra to assist in the restoration project. You know, of course, it sounds better, doesn't it, coming from a Levite himself to other Levites, you know, just more compelling. Anyway, Ezra, as we see here, takes practical steps to trusting in God. He chooses men of wisdom and diplomacy and skills of persuasion to go to Iddo. You know, all this is about ordinary human interactions with one another. But through it all, he says in verse 18, the good hand of our God was on us. And as we see, over 200 Levites came and eventually joined the crew. So we see here that trust in God is not always fireworks. It's not always spectacular, at least on the surface. Trust in God in general is spectacular, but not always on the surface, not always obvious at that time. Sometimes that happens and that is awesome. But most often, trusting in God involves the stuff of ordinary life, our interactions with one another at work and family and social circles. It is our interactions with those inside the community of faith in the church, our interactions outside with those outside the community of faith as we seek to share the good news. But most often, trust looks unremarkable. It is slow, it is organic, it is primarily relational. But here's the thing. Don't discount or minimize ordinary trust. Don't think to yourself, I'm not getting anything done here for God's kingdom. I'm not pulling off any remarkable jobs. In fact, I'm powerless because I can't operate in this gifting or that thing, or I'm not like this person over here and what they're achieving for the kingdom. Don't think like that. In fact, it's important for us to understand right here. Just press pause on our own thinking just now and zone in. God builds his kingdom by ordinary people telling other people about Jesus and demonstrating his love in real life. That's how he does it. God builds his kingdom by ordinary people telling others about Jesus and demonstrating his love in real life. So the majority of what we do as church is ordinary. The majority of what we do at home, as people, is ordinary. But let's not think that ordinary means boring or ineffective or powerless, because it doesn't. It is in these ordinary, these usual ways of trusting in God that play out most of the time. And as we see here, the hand of God, the good hand of God, is through the ordinary ways that we trust God. Apply wisdom in our human interactions with one another, and that is good and that is right. So the nature of trust is in these ordinary ways, these everyday ways, but also then nature of trust is extraordinary at times, all about launching out in faith. We see that in verses 21 to 23 in Ezra chapter 8. As we've already been thinking, Ezra refused an armed escort, a detachment of Persian soldiers to travel with them. We've seen why that is. He told the king of Persia, no, our God protects us. His hand is for good for those who follow him. And so we are choosing to trust God. Thanks for your offer, but we'll say no. They chose to trust God. Ezra chose to follow through. It came to a point when he had to follow through with what he said he believed, what he believed about God. It came to the point when they had to step across the line of faith, effectively, and walk out in trust. I don't know if you ever attended any of these really awful team building days. They were big back in the 90s. I don't even know if they still do this, but there's one classic team building exercise, if you're going with your work colleagues or whatever, where one member of the team would often be blindfolded or shut their eyes, and the rest of the team would gather behind him or her and sort of place out their arms like this, and the person who with the eyes shut or the blindfold would sort of say, right, I know you're behind me, we're on the same team here, I trust you. But there's a moment when that person then falls back into the arms of his team or her team. And the idea is that I trust you, I understand you're there, and you say you're there, and I do believe that, but I have to take a step to test that that's real, to fall back and know that you're going to catch me. And then the idea is that this builds trust among the team, which it never did. But anyway, that was the point. And, but the idea is here, and why I'm saying this to you, is that Ezra and his community had to make choices and behave as if they are true and follow through with God. They had to really trust that God is who he said he is, and then move forward with that in mind. extraordinary faith, launching out in faith. So they proclaimed a fast, it says. They humbled themselves before God. They reminded themselves of who he is and who they are in relation to him. And they sought from God. They pleaded before God in prayer for a safe journey. Get us there in one piece, O Lord. Then off they went. After they did that, off they went. They chose to trust. They chose to walk out in faith. And they had no way, don't forget, they had no way of telling what might happen as soon as they left the territory of Persia. Off they went. And don't forget also, they had riches on board. They had lots and lots of precious artifacts, valuable articles that would have been easy pickings for any bandits or ambushes or whatever. There were also families, there were children, not to mention the fact that it was about a 1,000-mile round trip. It took them about 4 months. But it says in verse 23, God listened to our prayers. And in verse 32, fast forward a little bit, we came to Jerusalem. Extraordinary trust. They believed God, they trusted him, then they followed through and lived in the reality of their trust. Extraordinary and ordinary trust. So sometimes for us, trust is confessing things about God, it's believing about God, then it's using the skills, using the opportunities, the gifts that we are given to live for God in that ordinary, everyday process. Sometimes that's what trust looks like. Sometimes trust is taking hold of God's promises, it is fasting and praying, but then it's launching out into the unknown, saying, we're doing this for you, God. We don't know how it's going to go. Show your glory. You know, we might crash and burn, but we're with you and you're with us and you've got us. Then off we go. Amazing steps of faith. But you see, the nature of trust, and the thing that's really important here, the nature of trust is not either ordinary trust or extraordinary trust, and you just pick which one you are. You're either an ordinary person or an extraordinary person. That's not how it is. It's not either or, it's both and. Both ordinary trust and extraordinary trust. At work, at play, in the lives of believers in Jesus and in the lives of the church. You know, in the communal aspects of the church. And of course, it depends on the situation and the season in life. It depends what God puts in front of you. It depends how the Holy Spirit guides you, guides us, the community, the gospel community, on mission. Sometimes God asks us to obey him. He always asks us to obey him and trust him with the ordinary. Trust the fruit to him. Trust the results to him. Sometimes he calls us into greater hope, to greater faith. To do remarkable things, to launch out, not knowing how things might turn out. But sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's extraordinary, sometimes it's ordinary. And so let me challenge you a little bit here before we finish this point. Are you waiting for an extraordinary moment, an extraordinary thing for God to ask you to trust him with? When in fact, God is calling you now to trust him in the ordinary, to be contented with the ordinary, with the everyday life. Are you looking for the extraordinary when he's saying, no, trust me in the ordinary, trust me with what you have now? Is that you? Or maybe the flip side. Maybe God is calling you to do something, to trust him in an extraordinary way. With a certain project or a certain calling? Is he calling you to trust him to go out, not knowing how things might turn out, but exercising extraordinary trust for him?